Picture this. You are a prehistoric human. Not a Roman citizen, not an Egyptian farmer, not even a Bronze Age villager with a mud hut and a questionable goat. We are going much further back than that. You are a hunter-gatherer living somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa roughly 100,000 years ago. You wake up every morning with one primary objective: do not die today. You hunt, you forage, you watch the tree line for things that want to eat you. You manage your relationships with the 20 or 30 other humans in your group because those relationships are literally the difference between surviving a bad season and not. The list of things that could kill you on any given day is long and not particularly imaginative in its variety. Predators, rival groups, infected wounds, broken bones that never heal right, parasites, contaminated water, starvation, falls, snakes, childbirth. The ancient world was generous with its methods. Now here is the question nobody thinks to ask about that person. Could they have died from cancer? Your instinct is probably no, and that instinct makes complete sense, because cancer feels modern. It feels like a disease civilization manufactured for itself. Something that arrived in the package deal with cigarettes, car exhaust, processed food, and the specific stress of refreshing your inbox at midnight. Cancer feels like it requires modernity as a prerequisite, like you need to have invented the drive-thru before the universe is allowed to give you colon cancer. That instinct, it turns out, is wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely, fundamentally, and fascinatingly wrong. Today we are going to find out exactly when cancer first appeared in the human story, how it affected our earliest ancestors, what a prehistoric human with cancer actually experienced, and what all of that reveals about who those people really were. This one goes somewhere you don't expect. Let's go. Before anything else, we need to establish what cancer actually is, because everything else in this video depends on getting this right, and the popular understanding of cancer contains a misconception that distorts the entire conversation. Cancer is not a single disease. It is a category, an umbrella term for over 100 distinct diseases sharing one defining biological feature: cells that divide uncontrollably and refuse to stop. In a healthy body, cell division is tightly regulated. Cells grow, divide, do their job, and eventually die through a process called apoptosis, programmed cell death, making way for new cells. Cancer happens when a mutation in the DNA disrupts that regulatory system. A cell ignores the stop signals. It divides when it shouldn't. It produces copies of itself that also ignore the stop signals. The resulting mass of abnormal cells forms a tumor. If those cells acquire the ability to travel through the bloodstream and establish new growths elsewhere in the body, the cancer has metastasized and the situation has become significantly more serious. Here is the critical point. Mutations in DNA do not require modernity. They happen because DNA replication is an imperfect process. Every time a cell divides, roughly 3.2 billion base pairs of genetic code need to be copied precisely. The error rate is remarkably low, but in a body undergoing trillions of cell divisions over a lifetime, even a very low error rate produces errors. Most of those errors are harmless or caught by repair mechanisms. Occasionally, one hits the wrong gene at the wrong moment. That process has been happening in every living organism with complex cells since complex cellular life first evolved. It has nothing to do with anything humans invented or consumed. It is simply what happens when biology gets complex enough to require cell division. Cancer is not a disease of modernity. Cancer is a consequence of being alive. You want proof of just how ancient cancer is? Let's go to the fossil record. And let's go far. The oldest confirmed cancer in any organism we have fossil evidence of belongs to a non-avian dinosaur. Not a mammal, not a primate, a dinosaur. A 2020 study in the journal Lancet Oncology described a fossilized foot bone from the late Cretaceous period, roughly 70 to 75 million years old, showing unmistakable evidence of osteosarcoma, an aggressive primary bone cancer. The same cancer that still gets diagnosed in human children and teenagers today was present in a creature that went extinct 66 million years before the first human being existed. That is not a coincidence or an anomaly. That is biology doing what biology does regardless of who is alive to experience it. Now let's move forward to something directly relevant to our own species. In 2016, a research team from South Africa published findings from two hominin fossils recovered from the Swartkrans cave system near Johannesburg. The first fossil was a foot bone. Analysis using high-resolution CT scanning and microscopic histology identified patterns consistent with osteosarcoma. The second fossil was a vertebra from a different individual, showing characteristics of a benign bone tumor. Neither of these individuals was Homo sapiens. At 1.7 million years old, these fossils predate our species by well over 1 million years. These were earlier hominins, possibly Australopithecus or early Homo, using primitive stone tools. Living before controlled fire was widespread. And they had cancer. 1.7 million years. That is how far back the cancer story in our lineage goes. Moving through the fossil record, the evidence continues accumulating. A Neanderthal rib fragment from a European site showing signs of a fibrous tumor. Homo sapiens skeletal remains from prehistoric burial sites across 3 continents bearing lesions consistent with malignant disease. A prehistoric individual from what is now Sudan, whose skeleton showed cancer-related lesions on over 30 separate bones, skull, vertebrae, sternum, ribs, long bones, in a pattern researchers identified as consistent with widespread metastatic cancer that had spread throughout the body before death. The evidence is not ambiguous, and it is not sparse. Cancer was present in prehistoric human populations. It was present in our pre-human ancestors. It is, in the most literal biological sense, part of our inheritance as living organisms. Now we need to address the numbers honestly, because while cancer was definitely present in prehistoric populations, was it as common as it is today? The evidence suggests no. And understanding why requires looking at 2 major factors: the age structure of prehistoric populations and the specific carcinogen exposure of prehistoric life. Age first, because it is by far the most important variable and the one that gets the least attention. Cancer risk increases dramatically and non-linearly with age. The reason is accumulation. Every additional year of life means more cell divisions, which means more opportunities for DNA copying errors to accumulate, which means more chances for a cancer-initiating mutation to survive and proliferate. Most cancers are rare in people under 40 and become dramatically more common after 50. In modern developed countries, the median age of cancer diagnosis is in the mid-60s. Now consider the age structure of a prehistoric population. The popular notion that everyone died at 30 is an oversimplification. That figure is pulled down by very high infant and child mortality, and adults who survived childhood could live into their 50s, 60s, and occasionally beyond. Skeletal evidence confirms this. Healed injuries accumulated over decades, severely worn teeth, arthritic joint changes, bone density losses consistent with aging. Prehistoric people did get old, but the proportion of the population reaching the high-risk cancer ages was dramatically smaller than today. High infant mortality, high child mortality, and significant adult mortality from violence, infection, and accident meant the population skewed young. The age brackets where cancer becomes most likely were consistently underrepresented. If cancer is partly a disease of accumulated years, a population with fewer old people will have less cancer. That is not a comfortable observation when you follow it to its conclusion. A significant portion of our elevated modern cancer rates is a direct consequence of our success at keeping people alive. We have eliminated or controlled many of the things that used to kill people before cancer could develop. And so cancer, always present in the biological background, gets more opportunities to emerge because people now live long enough to reach the ages where it becomes probable. The ancient world killed people efficiently. That efficiency, grimly, kept cancer rates lower than they would otherwise have been. The second factor is carcinogen exposure, and this is more nuanced than the simple story of prehistoric life as inherently clean. Modern cancer research has documented a well-evidenced list of behavioral and environmental cancer risk factors. Tobacco smoke accounts for roughly 30% of all cancer deaths in high-smoking countries. Chronic heavy alcohol consumption raises cancer risk across multiple organ systems. Obesity, specifically the chronic inflammation and hormonal dysregulation it produces, is now recognized as a risk factor for at least 13 distinct cancer types. Industrial chemical exposure, including asbestos, benzene, and formaldehyde, is directly carcinogenic. Certain viral infections drive a significant fraction of global cancer incidence. Prehistoric humans were not exposed to most of these. No tobacco. No chronic alcohol consumption. Deliberate fermentation required the agricultural surpluses that came with settled civilization. No obesity. The combination of constant physical activity and a diet without refined sugars or ultra-processed foods made significant excess body fat essentially incompatible with the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. No industrial chemicals. But prehistoric humans were exposed to something we don't talk about enough: smoke. Evidence of controlled fire use by hominins extends back at least 400,000 years. Fire was not occasional for prehistoric humans, it was central to daily life. Warmth, predator protection, cooking, light. Prehistoric people spent enormous amounts of time around fires, and in enclosed spaces like caves and rock shelters, they lived with fires burning for warmth through cold nights. Wood smoke contains polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, benzene, formaldehyde, and other well-documented carcinogens, particularly for the respiratory tract. Modern research on populations that still cook over open fires documents elevated rates of lung and upper respiratory cancers associated with chronic indoor smoke exposure. A prehistoric human sleeping in a smoky cave for decades was accumulating a real carcinogen burden. Not as severe as a modern cigarette smoker, but not zero either. Ultraviolet radiation was another genuine prehistoric carcinogen. The earliest Homo sapiens in equatorial Africa faced intense UV exposure. While dark skin provided substantial protection, populations that migrated to higher latitudes over thousands of years lost that pigmentation. Lighter skin aided vitamin D synthesis at lower UV intensities, but increased skin cancer risk during sun exposure. The evolutionary relationship between prehistoric migration, pigmentation change, and skin cancer risk is an active and genuinely fascinating area of ongoing research. So the prehistoric carcinogen picture wasn't clean. Lower than modern industrial exposure in most respects, yes, but not zero. And the specific carcinogens that were present, smoke and UV radiation, were ones prehistoric humans encountered constantly throughout their entire lives. Now for the part that most people don't think about: what actually happened to a prehistoric human who developed cancer? Many early-stage internal cancers would have been completely undetectable without modern diagnostic tools. A tumor in the lung, the colon, the pancreas. These can grow for months before producing noticeable symptoms. In a prehistoric context with no imaging, no blood tests, no biopsies, early cancer was effectively invisible. The person felt fine. And then, eventually, they didn't. The cancers that prehistoric communities would have noticed were the ones producing obvious signs: a visible lump beneath the skin, the profound wasting of cancer cachexia, the relentless weight loss as the body consumes itself. Visible to everyone in a small group. The deep, constant bone pain of metastatic cancer spreading to the skeleton, described by modern patients as among the most severe pain experiences associated with any disease. Severe fatigue, significant bleeding, difficulty breathing. These symptoms in combination announced themselves. The people around an individual with advanced cancer would have known something was profoundly wrong. They wouldn't have had a name for it. They wouldn't have had any understanding of the cellular biology causing it. But they would have seen the suffering. They would have watched the person decline. And here is what the archaeological record tells us happened in those circumstances. It tells us they stayed. The fossil record of prehistoric human communities contains consistent, repeated, geographically widespread evidence of care for severely ill and disabled individuals. This is not a minor or ambiguous finding. It is one of the clearest signals in prehistoric archaeology about what values prehistoric communities actually operated by. The most famous example is Shanidar 1, a Neanderthal individual from Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, dating to roughly 45,000 to 65,000 years ago. This individual showed evidence of a withered right arm, likely lost or severely damaged early in life. He had suffered a severe blow to the left side of his face, causing likely damage to his left eye. He had multiple healed rib fractures. He showed significant degenerative joint disease. And he had survived to late adulthood in a physically demanding prehistoric environment. That survival was not possible without sustained support from others. Shanidar 1 needed other people to feed him, protect him, assist him in ways his damaged body could not manage alone. And they did, for years, possibly decades. Shanidar 1 is not an isolated case. The prehistoric record contains dozens of comparable examples across multiple species and time periods. Individuals with congenital disabilities surviving far past the point where independent survival was possible. Individuals with healed traumatic injuries requiring prolonged immobility. Immobility during which others must have been providing food and protection. The pattern is consistent and unmistakable. Prehistoric human communities, and apparently Neanderthal communities, practiced sustained care for members who were sick, injured, or disabled. The image of prehistoric life as purely brutal and transactional, with the weak simply abandoned when they became a burden, is not supported by the evidence. The evidence says the opposite. A prehistoric person dying of cancer, experiencing the wasting, the pain, the progressive loss of function, would likely have been cared for by their community through that dying. Fed when they could no longer forage. Protected when they could no longer defend themselves. Stayed with. What did those communities think was happening? What explanatory framework did a prehistoric healer reach for when confronted with a body visibly consuming itself from the inside? Across every pre-scientific culture for which we have substantial records, disease was primarily explained through supernatural frameworks. Illness was caused by malevolent spirits, by curses from enemies, by violations of spiritual taboo, by the withdrawal of ancestral protection. These weren't primitive delusions. They were rational responses to a world in which the true causes of disease, bacteria, viruses, cellular mutations, were completely invisible. When you cannot see the actual mechanism, you pattern match from what you can observe and build explanatory models from available evidence. In a pre-microscope world, those models inevitably incorporated forces beyond direct observation. Cancer, specifically, would have been extraordinarily difficult to explain even within a supernatural framework. An infection at least implies external contact. A wound has an obvious cause. Cancer has neither. It appears from nowhere. It grows within the body itself. It is, from a prehistoric observer's perspective, the body turning against itself for no discernible reason. The most natural interpretation in a spiritual framework would almost certainly have been possession. Something alien inhabiting the person, growing, consuming them from within. Treatment would have followed from that diagnosis. Ritual to expel the possessing entity, prayer, invocation of protective forces, medicinal plants applied within a ceremonial context. The earliest written records describing cancer give us a window into how early historical peoples were already grappling with this. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text dating to roughly 1600 BCE but likely derived from much older sources, describes what are almost certainly breast tumors and states plainly that there is no treatment. Not that the gods must be consulted. Not that a ritual is required. Simply, there is no treatment. That is a remarkable statement. In one of the oldest medical documents in human history, an ancient healer looked at cancer and wrote, honestly, that it could not be cured. The Ebers Papyrus from the same period recommends cauterization, burning the tumor, as an approach. This is, interestingly, not entirely without merit. Modern surgeons still use cauterization in cancer procedures. It was an empirical discovery made thousands of years before anyone understood what a tumor cell was. For prehistoric humans predating even these early medical traditions, The response would have been less systematic, but no less sincere. Whatever the community understood about healing would have been brought to bear, and when there was nothing left to bring, apparently, they simply stayed. Here is the perspective shift this topic ultimately points toward. We tend to think about prehistoric humans through the lens of what they lacked. No medicine, no technology, no understanding of disease. We frame them as limited in ways that distance them from us. As if the absence of our tools makes them fundamentally different kinds of people, less capable of the emotional and social complexity we associate with fully human experience. Cancer dismantles that distance. Stripped of its medical context, cancer is the experience of a body failing slowly, in a way that produces profound suffering and ultimately death. It is accompanied by fear, by grief from the people around the dying person, by the complex emotional territory of watching someone decline and being unable to stop it. That experience was present in prehistoric communities. Those communities felt it. They responded to it. They stayed. The very first time a prehistoric community watched one of their own develop a visible tumor and begin to decline, and we know this happened over 1 million years ago, they faced exactly what every human community in every subsequent era has faced. The fact of illness that cannot be fixed. The question of what you owe someone who is suffering and will not recover. The answer the archaeological record shows, repeated across time and geography in community after prehistoric community, is the same answer that appears in every subsequent human culture that ever grappled with that question. You stay. You feed them. You sit with them. You do not leave them alone with it. That answer is not a product of civilization. It is not a product of religion, philosophy, or medical ethics. It predates all of those things by hundreds of thousands of years. It appears to be something we arrived with, a disposition woven into the social fabric of human communities from the very beginning. Both cancer and the impulse to care for the people it afflicts are ancient. Both are part of the human story from the very start. So, did ancient humans die from cancer? Yes. Unambiguously, evidentially, demonstrably, yes. The fossil record confirms it at 1.7 million years in our own lineage. The broader evolutionary record confirms it at 75 million years in organisms that preceded us. Cancer is not a modern disease. It is not a consequence of civilization. It is a consequence of being a complex living organism in a universe where DNA replication is imperfect and time allows errors to accumulate. It was probably less common in prehistoric populations than in modern ones, not because prehistoric humans were biologically superior to us, but because fewer of them lived long enough to reach the ages where cancer becomes most likely. That fact says uncomfortable things about the relationship between longer lifespans and cancer prevalence. Our success at keeping people alive is, in part, what gave cancer more room to operate. When prehistoric humans got cancer, they died without a name for it, without a treatment for it, and without any understanding of the cellular biology causing it. They died in pain that nothing available to them could adequately address. They died surrounded by people who, the evidence strongly suggests, cared for them anyway. That continuity, from a prehistoric community sitting with a dying member in a cave 50,000 years ago to a family sitting in a modern hospital room, is one of the longest unbroken threads in the human story. The disease is the same. The helplessness in the face of it is the same. And apparently the response has always been the same too. We have always stayed.